Hello, good morning, and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chats on the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry we're in of writing and self-publishing. And today we are delighted to have a very special guest from a very special part of the world, Karl Hörnell, an engineer, game developer, cartoonist, and author. How are you doing today, Karl? And you're calling in all the way from Sweden, right?
Yes, I'm fine, and I'm calling from partly cloudy Stockholm today.
That's amazing.
Sweden, yes.
I've always wanted to go to Stockholm. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to have you as a guest. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. Craig, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Roland, and thanks for joining us all the way from out there. Karl, it's great to talk to people from around the world because, you know, we're all sort of doing the same thing when we're self-publishing, right? It's figuring stuff out for ourselves and learning how to, learn from each other, which is the whole goal of this podcast. So, today we want to talk about the idea of writing with some ambiguity, right? Not giving away everything, keeping some things intentionally from the reader. And this is something that always interests me. When I've been writing a project lately, and I've been sort of struggling with that idea of, giving too much information, not giving enough, wondering how the readers are going to take it. Are they going to think, didn't explain that, even though it'll get explained later, right? So you always want to sort of walk that balance, and hopefully you have some good tips on how to do that. So why don't we start off? Like, you have a pretty varied resume there of different things that you're known for. So why don't we talk a bit about that? What got you started with writing when you come from that other diverse background? What led you to this?
Well, there is a good segue. I was asked to write a developer diary when I was working on a retro computer game a couple of years back. And I was going to do it in English and for a larger audience, which I hadn't done before. But I sort of became comfortable with that. And after a while, I thought that maybe I should use this experience to do something that had been on my bucket list for a while, to write a novel. So I did that in English, and I didn't publish it. I just printed 25 copies for friends and family, and then I was done. I was never going to write another novel in my life, I thought. But then this very inspiring idea came along. And since I had the experience, there was no excuse. I would have to write it.
And so what was the idea that you had?
The idea sort of came about in an email conversation. How come no one has made a movie like The Dirty Dozen or Suicide Squad, but with AIs instead of characters? And you could make it more interesting if you let each one be based on some sort of famous computer program or robot in fiction.
Oh, that's quite so. Like, I was thinking famous robot from fiction, HAL from the 2001: A Space Odyssey, for example. Is that what you're kind of thinking of?
Exactly, and HAL is actually one of them in the book.
Oh. It would be my first choice as well. What an interesting idea.
Yeah, and I was hoping someone else would do that, but nobody did, and there's sort of a limited window in which that book would be relevant. So I have to do it quickly.
Well, yeah, now
as technology is changing so AI, quickly.
Right?
Yeah. Okay, so how did it go from writing your writing process, because you hadn't written a book before and you weren't really planning on writing a book? So how did you pull all that together? Did you I assume you're an avid reader, especially if you were waiting for a specific book to come along that you wanted to read and then decide, I'm going to write it myself. But how did you figure all that out?
I figured it out by watching YouTube videos. And sort of had to invent some of the steps along the way. But I'm not actually much of a reader. I mostly consume science fiction in the form of either movies, television, or comic books.
Okay.
There are some exceptions, but mostly I would say that I'm too impatient to spend that much time on a story.
Now, you're a comic book writer yourself.
Yes.
And how does that impact when you're trying to tell a story through long form writing? Because it's kind of interesting. They're two very different mediums, but they have a lot of crossover.
Yes, that's true. It's hard to say, actually. I think that I'm mostly experienced with comic strips. So you tell a story in 2 or 3 pictures, and that's very, very different from doing it in a book. But there is some overlap in the terms that, in the sense that you can you can gain a lot if you optimize the dialogue. That's important for the timing in a comic strip, and I think I have that's one of my strengths as a writer. Good dialogue.
And dialogue is definitely key.
It's funny, we've had a couple of guests on recently talking about screenplays and how there was one person who suggested, you know, they actually wrote their story out as a screenplay before writing it as a novel, because, you know, most of it was driven by dialogue. And I guess in comic strips as well, like the writer of the comic strip, so often it's really the dialogue is what you're writing, and that does drive things forward. How do you make your dialogue seem realistic, especially when you've got characters who are AIs?
Yeah, if they are based on some existing character, then of course I would have to try to make it feel like the original in some way. But for normal people, it's I don't know. I have to sound it out in my head and try to hear what feels realistic. And one thing I've discovered is that the fewer words you can use most of the time, the better it will sound, the more believable it will sound.
Right. That's one of the keys, I think, when we write dialogue, is sort of saying it out loud to hear that it flows and sounds like real dialogue. And that's one of the problems that some writers have, is that, you know, they write dialogue a little too much like prose, and then when you read it out loud, you think, well, that's not how people really speak, right? So you almost want to say it out loud. Yeah.
I've always thought
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I've always thought some of the reasons some particular writers have remained famous and popular and relevant despite the decades and the centuries, like Jane Austen, Ernest Hemingway, for example, is because they are so good at writing dialogue. And Ernest Hemingway, especially, he would write dialogue, just lines of text without even explaining who was saying them, and he was so skilled in being able to capture people's voices that you'd be able to tell which character it was just by the words they were saying, rather than having to have that pointed out to you. And I think that's a great way to tell a story.
Yeah. I noticed one thing, that good dialogue, it can create a problem in one situation. And that's when you're trying to convert it to an audiobook, and you want to do it with automatic voice generation. Because when you express yourself in short sentences, when you express yourself in short sentences, emphasis becomes key. It's important. The emphasis on one particular word can change the meaning of a sentence if it's very short, in a more dramatic way than if it's long. Then in other words, then the context can convey the meaning. But if you have short sentences that often rely on emphasis, and I also use that in ordinary text, not just in dialogue, then it becomes very difficult for a an automated voice generator to keep up and to make the right choices.
Yeah, I think a lot of people find that in general, even with regular books and for audiobook generation, when using AI voice is a fairly new idea. And I think a lot of authors are sort of still relying on humans to do the reading to make sure that you have that emphasis, which is, something that I think the industry is happy about. I mean, they don't necessarily want to give it all up to AI, especially, in the writing world, we have a lot of concerns about AI taking over and doing our jobs. And I don't think that it's taking over for writing novels yet. I haven't seen any good novels written by AI, and we don't really want to. But with the creating the images, we see more of AI being used more for that, and we are starting to hear about people using it for audiobooks. But I think that's one of the main concerns in general, is that it doesn't sound as realistic, with emphasis on words and such. So yeah, that's a common issue. So
yeah, you can do it manually, but then there's actually, I don't know how much in detail I should go into this, but there's a company called 11 Labs. It's one of the leading voice generators.
Yeah. Oh,
and they have an app.
Yeah.
They have an app that takes straight text from ebooks and converts it into spoken audio on the fly without any editing. And that sounds terrible for my book. I tried it, and I had to tell them to remove my book from their catalog. You need to manually specify which words are emphasized, and you can do that now, and you can export the entire project to a distributor. But you're not allowed to manually edit the actual audio files. So it has to be a closed system for now. That's true for Google, for 11 Labs, for Apple. And that means that some of the timing, some of the volume won't be correct. And it will sound worse than if you had a person doing it. You can fix most of that manually, but you're not allowed to, because that will disqualify you for distribution.
That's interesting. I've been trying the Amazon's beta project, where they allow you to have a digital reader, and I haven't published any of my books of that because I have concerns about replacing real voice artists with digital ones, although sometimes they can sound almost to the point you can't tell the difference. But I think that's a closed loop system as well, and you will have to go through manually and upload a new, like some sections I've had to upload a brand new manuscript, having edited the dialogue in there to make it actually sound how I want it to sound. So that is a real challenge, and I think that's one thing that's going to put a lot of people off the idea of experimenting with AI voices to narrate their books. What I find so fascinating, though, is your book is about AI characters. So normally I think a lot of people might think, hey, you shouldn't replace a hardworking real life human voice artist with a digital one, except when you have characters who are AIs, it almost seems like you should do that, because it would make their dialogue.
It seems like the proper case for it. And one of my ideas was to do that, but I would have sort of reverse it by having human cameo voices for the AIs, but all the people will be done by AI voices.
Right. Okay, so let's move to the topic we want to discuss today, which is the idea of when you're writing, leaving a little bit of intentional ambiguity into your scenes and your dialogue, whatever it is, so that the reader is left guessing or trying to figure things out. And obviously, the case of, if you're writing a mystery, that's obviously something you want to do. You definitely don't want to give things away. You want to leave little clues. But I think in any kind of writing, there is the opportunity to add in some of that stuff. So why don't you tell us a little bit about, your thoughts on that, and why authors want to have leave in some of that ambiguity?
Yeah, I actually asked a chatbot about this not long ago. I asked it to list a few of the most important parts of good sci-fi writing. And on top of the list was world building. And the advice ended with the more detailed and coherent your world, the more believable your story will be. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And I also think that the definition of world is a bit unclear. That doesn't necessarily have to be the world in a literal sense. It can be just the confined area in which the story takes place, and that can be enough.
And I think when you're writing too, there's that idea of how much ambiguity you want to leave so that readers are not left wondering if they missed something or you just didn't explain something correctly, right? That's, I think, what I often struggle with is thinking to myself, well, I know what's going to happen, so leaving these little clues, to me, they make sense, right? But for somebody who's coming to the book without the knowledge of what's going to happen, how do you know how much to say and how much not to say, so that it's not sort of like they're not left frustrated or wondering whether or not they missed a clue, or they didn't follow something, or you didn't explain something properly?
Yeah, I try to think of if I'm going to explain this to my parents, what would they need to know? And I start by making sure that everything that's going to happen, unless it's a surprise, it needs to be explained to some extent in advance. What context do we need to understand what's going to happen here? But not much beyond that. So a bare minimum of information necessary for the reader not to be confused.
What is it Hemingway called it? The iceberg method, where you give just enough information for, well, the information you do give in some ways is the tip of the iceberg, and the reader can work out so much more from that. And it's small details, like a man who has a handkerchief in the collar of his shirt probably came from a military background, because that's what they do in the military. And it's like, you can have him blowing his nose and it can add so much more characterization if you're familiar with things like that.
Yeah, I think too, when you're writing about existing characters, so for instance, you have Hal in your book, do you want to presume any knowledge of those existing characters from your audience, or how much do you want to explain about those characters?
In my book, I actually don't explain them at all. I leave them as mostly Easter eggs.
Okay.
But I tell, of course, enough information about the characters that their actions make sense. And then if someone recognizes them from a movie, that's just an extra. You don't need that information to understand them, but it's still rewarding.
I love Easter eggs in books. All the people who read my romance books that I write are probably sick of Easter eggs related to James Bond, because I probably have 3 or 4 in every single book I write. But it's very rewarding as a reader when you read something and you're like, oh, I get that. I understand that reference.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it almost adds another layer to the book, where people that have the knowledge of the topic will get sort of another level out of the book than somebody who doesn't have that knowledge. The person that doesn't have that knowledge can still enjoy the book, but someone who does might enjoy it and have an extra level of enjoyment, because they know sort of that backstory of the characters, or whatever it is, the setting, all that stuff, right?
Do you also find ambiguity when you're writing. You talked about ambiguity in world building, and I think an obstacle that trips a lot of science fiction authors up is they start writing their story and they're focusing on the human part of the story, and then they encounter something that is part of the world they're building, like, I don't know, a space rocket that can go to Mars. And it's very tempting for them to try and explain the technology behind how this space rocket works, when in fact you could have the ambiguity of, it's like, there is a rocket that goes to Mars. There is a perfectly rational scientific explanation for why it works, but you don't need to know that to enjoy this story. So you're just gonna have to assume that the stuff we're writing about works. And maybe later on you can explain more, maybe in other books, maybe inside things. But for the focus of the story, you can be ambiguous about that because it's not relevant to the real thrust of the story, which is the emotional journey of your characters.
Yeah, that's true. And I know that some science fiction writers, they consider it sort of a hallmark of the genre that you do explain everything. That's part of the charm in their view, but I don't agree with that. So I try to focus on the story instead. That's the main priority for me.
And how do you do that? So when you're coming up with a story, you've got quite a complicated world that you've built, but how do you identify what is the most important thing to stick to, what you can't be ambiguous about?
Yeah, that's always the motivation of the characters, I believe, that you need to focus on. And for everything else, it's keep it out of the way of the story as much as you can. And one technique I use for being vague is that instead of having the narrator explain the details, explain what some of the characters think about it, and their limited understanding also limits the information, and the reader doesn't need to know more than they know.
Right. And I mean, by keeping some of that information back, you also let readers imagine things in their own ways, letting their own imagination fill in the gaps sometimes.
Yeah, and it also helps from making the story obsolete. There's one part of the book where I technically describe the properties of an AI system, but whatever numbers I would give would be unimpressive in a few years. And if I make it too big, then it becomes not really credible. So I just I let the main character think about it, and he only knows that the number of parameters that defines the system is in the trillions. He doesn't remember right now how many they are, and only that the backup can fit on a couple of high-end hard drives. And that's a very relative measurement, because we don't really know when the story takes place how much space there is on such a hard drive.
That's very true. I watch older movies sometimes, and they have they're talking about technology, and it's like, this is meant to be the greatest thing, and they're like, we have this modem, it's the fastest modem ever, 56 megabytes per minute or something, and now we look at that and it's just that ages something so quickly. And so, yeah, having the ambiguity there means your science fiction doesn't age as quickly as it might do. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of times why books and movies don't necessarily specify a date. They'll say something like in the near future, or you know,
or long ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Right. And I think you do that with places as well. I know when I used to write, I would romance novels, I would very rarely specify, say, the city that they were in. Even if I have an idea of the city in my head, I don't necessarily want to give that away. First of all, it saves me from having to get all the details correct, right? Mm-hmm. But also, it's like, you know, those things will change over time, and it leaves more to the imagination of the reader. They don't have to like keep it fixed in their mind that they're in this one place, right? They could be in any small town or big city or whatever. I think with science fiction, you have to do that a bit more with some of the details. Otherwise, like you said, you will date yourself, and we do see that, a lot. You're capitalizing on an AI trend right now, which is new, and like you said, time limited on how you want to release the book now. But in 10 years from now, so much might have changed. So it's hard to.
Yeah. The basic premise of the book. The basic premise of the book is that this is somewhere in the future, in the near future, after we have cracked artificial general intelligence. So that's the main part of the setting. And I don't say how many years ahead. It's in my head, I imagine it somewhere between 10 and 15 years.
I was thinking about, because I've always loved science fiction, and I read a lot of my father's science fiction books that he read in the 50s and 60s. And it's interesting, things like AI were written about then, but of course people didn't exist in a world where that was even a conceivable thing. So that was real science fiction. And isn't it funny that we now live in a period where that science fiction has become science reality? But I think one of the reasons these old stories from the 50s and 60s remain relevant is, just as you said, they had a certain ambiguity about how this technology operated. And it was more the conceptual idea of what this technology was and what it represented, as opposed to this is how it works.
Yes, and at the very least, you could see that as an alternative route of history. Of course, some other things people weren't very good at predicting, like social media, the internet, smartphones, that shape our present to a great degree.
It's crazy when you think of science fiction stories set in the far future, when some of the things that we take for granted today didn't exist, and how useful they would be. I remember watching an episode of Star Trek the other day that was set in 2024, and the action that was going on in 2024, it was the future then, except they didn't have things like cell phones and stuff like that, which would have solved all the problems of the episode within seconds.
Yeah, that's part of the problem when you predict too much in science fiction, is you can get those predictions very wrong, but sometimes it's the opposite, right? You predict something and then the future sort of creates what you imagine because they think it's a good idea. I think we see on Star Trek a lot of the data paths that they had, and that was pre iPads and all that stuff, right? And we sort of caught up with it, or the communicator that flips open, and then I think that was even before like the Nokia flip phone and all, which I think might have been modeled around those things. And if they had never existed in the media, then maybe we never would have seen them, or they would have taken a different form factor. I think that's part of the fun of writing science fiction is being able to sort of predict stuff like that. But if you get it wrong, it can date your book or make it seem a little weird, depending on what you guessed at. But yeah, so things like social media, that's a good point. Those things are even harder sometimes to imagine. So you almost have to take what exists now and just give it a little bit of a tweak to how you think it'll go.
Yeah, and that doesn't always work either.
Right.
I was thinking about the first RoboCop movie, which is set in 2015. Kind of.
Oh, is it
far back
2015 it's set in? Oh, wow. Yeah. That's set in the past. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Although I've been to Detroit. It's quite realistic.
Yeah, and media plays a large part in that movie, but it's always it is the corporate media, but the thought hadn't occurred to the authors that media would be in our modern times something that's usually catering to a specific political opinion instead of reporting news objectively. And it would have been very confusing if they had done something like that in that movie. So it's probably good that they didn't, but they failed to predict that part. And of course, also that there's no social media whatsoever in their reality.
That's a very interesting idea as well, because yeah, we could look back at things of fiction that were written in the past, and they've either aged well because they predicted something, or because of their political convictions at the time, they've aged very badly. I mean, there are books like 1984 and Brave New World that have remained relevant because they were identifying a political issue that we are still struggling with today. But there are other books, I guess, that have kind of like veered off because they have so many elements that today don't track with what we think of. I love Jules Verne as a writer. He's one of my favorite authors, and he wrote a wonderful book called 5 Weeks in a Balloon about these Europeans traveling across Africa in a hot air balloon. But you read it now and it's egregiously racist, and so that's one of the struggles with it, is like, wow, the attitudes that people had back then are not reflective of the attitudes that people have today, and that makes it difficult to enjoy and appreciate these older books.
Yeah.
And I guess some ambiguity there is exactly what you need. If they were perhaps if they were perhaps more ambiguous about their feelings about native African people, then maybe the book these days wouldn't be so controversial.
Yeah.
I think that's an issue with a lot of stuff that we look at today, reflecting the attitudes of the times, and those times move on, and then all of a sudden those attitudes seem like an issue. So what are some of do you use, like, let's say, beta readers or advanced readers of some sort to go through the book and give you feedback on things like whether or not you've given enough information, whether they really understand what's going on, whether there was enough ambiguity that like they didn't feel like they were getting an info dump, or that they were able to follow along and didn't think, oh, this should have been explained better?
Oh, I tried that. I set up an entire project with an outline of the book, description of every chapter, details and stuff, previews, sent it to 3 friends. 9 of them read it. So I had to go through all of it by myself.
That's interesting. Now, why didn't they read it? Did they give you feedback on why they didn't read it? Or was it just, I mean, sometimes people send me things and I just don't have time to read them, even though you want to.
I think they were too busy. And they had months to do it, but they didn't. And then they forgot about it.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that we often give advice on in terms of beta reading and our review reading is not to give it to friends and family, although usually for a different reason, which is you want honest feedback, and sometimes your friends and family will not give you as honest as a stranger would. But when you're with something like beta reading, which is so important, it's often good to go to a professional beta reader, just because not only for that reason, but also so that that you will get that information in a timely manner, because it's often so important to hear about what other people think. Because like I said, in your own head, because everything that you're writing about, sometimes it seems a lot more clear to you, but to someone else, it might not be as clear.
Yeah. I did actually, when I had started writing the book, when I got into the actual process and left the planning stage, I found 2 people who were willing to read and give feedback. So at least I got it from them, but I had hoped to get it much sooner, to get a better idea whether the story structure was sound or not.
Right. And have you gotten any reception from anyone else since then, or from readers that have read the book after that?
So far, only friends and family, and they are generally positive about it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, what kind of tips would you have for other authors about, when they're writing, and about making those decisions about what to include and what not to include, and the importance of the I guess the balance between giving too much information and not enough information?
Yeah, it's hard to give any advice except use your common sense, but that's not very useful. it also depends on what your goal is with the book. If you want to create a world where you dazzle people with your imagination, then maybe it's a good idea to use lots of descriptions and background and world building, if that's what your readers expect. But if someone is just interested in the story, it's not particularly a science fiction fan, then you're going to have to be a bit more restrictive and basically cut everything that can be cut.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I guess that comes down to targeting. I write romance novels, and I read lots of romance novels, and you do have romance novels that are science fiction. You know, they're involving sometimes women falling in love with aliens and things like this. They have spaceships and colonization and all this stuff. But a lot of the hard science fiction elements have been pulled back because people are reading those books more for the romance than the science fiction. So that does seem like it's you have to be cognizant of who your audience is and present the story that you're trying to tell in a way that they would enjoy interpreting it.
Right.
Yeah, I guess that's the takeaway. Know your audience.
Yep, definitely. And I mean, you don't want to, I think in general, like in any kind of thing, but science fiction more than anything, you don't want to overload your world building approach, right? You don't want to give so much detail that you're really fixing people's imagination to a certain thing. The more you leave to ambiguity, the more you leave to their imagination, the more the world maybe sort of fits to their own worldview as opposed to yours, right? You want to guide them through it, but you want their own experiences to fill in the details to the extent that it makes it almost more relevant to them, right? I mean, and the only downside with that is what we see when a popular book gets converted into a movie or a television show. One of the biggest complaints you see every time is people that love the source material, when they see it portrayed on the screen with the director's vision, it's very different than what they thought. I have that feeling with Wheel of Time. I read those books many, many years ago, but they're, now it's a Prime show. And aside from changes to the story that they've done, the characters, most of them don't look anything like the characters looked like in my head.
Yeah,
That's very true. In romance books, especially, people like to have your female main character. They like to be ambiguous about what they look like, because then you can, as a reader, put yourself in their shoes.
That's a good idea. Yeah, and ambiguity. And I was thinking about how this connects back to drawing comics. If you look at a comic strip like Dilbert, before it was cancelled, you see that the characters are very often they often have blank expressions, and Dilbert himself doesn't even have a mouth most of the time, and his eyes are hidden behind glasses. So the reader fills in his reaction, and that makes it more effective in telling a joke.
Oh, they always say with humor, it's all about timing and delivery rather than even the actual words of the joke. So that's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, it's important for authors to think about these things and realize it's not about, lazy writing and saying, oh, I just don't want to include the details. Like, you should have those details in your head anyways, because they help you guide the story. Like, even though certain things, and a lot of times authors will do that, is they'll write out a whole, whatever you want to call it, a story Bible, or detailed character sketches and with all sorts of backstory, but not all that will necessarily get included in the final book. And that's not wasted writing. It sort of puts it in your head so that you can write a coherent story, but you don't necessarily have to include every one of those details, right? You only need to include the important ones. But as long as you know that, you can sort of maintain consistency when you're writing the book, as opposed to, if you just left it and, it didn't have that sort of stuff in your mind, you're more likely to put in inconsistencies in the book, or whether in physical details or the way that characters act, because you haven't really nailed that down in your head. So you might, take a left turn or a right turn, depending on the story, when really it should have always been a right turn based on who that character is, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect, that you can wait with giving the reader this information until after the story is done, like some fantasy books where they have some chapters at the end describing the maps and history and geography, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of fantasy books do that. They'll have maps, they'll have detailed character sort of character maps, I guess, telling you who all the characters were and who they're related to and all that stuff. I think too that's also for reference. I think Game of Thrones did that, if I remember. I mean, it's been so long. Sorry about that. But at the end of the book, you have a whole bunch of characters, and especially when there's a lot of characters in the book, sometimes you need to even refer to that. They'll mention somebody that they hadn't talked about in many chapters, and you're like, who is that again? You can go look it up in the back of the book. But in general, though, for plot stuff, you're not going to be seeing that at the end. But I think it, sometimes they'll do an epilogue to wrap up some of the stuff. But in general, though, yeah, I think keeping that stuff to yourself can really add a dimension to the writing, as opposed to being just too detailed and fixing things too much in reality in the minds of the readers.
Now, we are unfortunately approaching the top of the hour. This has been a fascinating discussion, but Karl, we would love it if you could tell our readers, not our readers, our listeners or our viewers, where they can find out more about your writing and this project that you're working on right now.
Well, the audiobook is still a work in progress, and you can find that for free on SoundCloud and archive.org. As soon as I find a new cameo voice, I will release a new version, but it's all available to listen to right now if they want to.
Well, absolutely. We will make sure to pop a link down below to that. And so if you are listening to this or watching it on YouTube and you've enjoyed what Karl has to say, make sure you scroll down there, click on that link and go and check out his work in progress. And as you do so, you will scroll past that big empty comment box. So why don't you leave Karl a comment and let him know how much you appreciate it, everything he shared with us today, and also your thoughts on ambiguity in fiction. Is that something you struggle with as a writer? Do you find yourself like trying to put too much detail in? Do you find yourself leaving too much detail out? We would love to know what your opinions are on that. So I think just before we wrap up, Craig, do you have any final questions for Karl?
No, I think that, this has been a really interesting discussion about, the perspective of not giving too much away. And it's useful even in other genres than science fiction. But that is one of those ones where it is almost more important because there are often so many details, and you have to have that balance between what to say, what not to say, and leaving it up to imagination and making sure everyone can follow along. If as long as the authors keep in mind what those details are, I think it's safer to leave some of them out without worrying about missing continuity or consistency problems. So thanks again for joining us all the way from Sweden, Karl. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, we are delighted to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have enjoyed listening to Karl, then make sure that while you're down there, leaving him a comment, you also hit that like button if you haven't already, that subscribe button, and of course, that bell icon, which will notify you every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked, which of course there will be next week, same time, same channel, a brand new episode of Fully Booked, and we look forward to seeing you there. So until then, cheerio.